Well, we're looking at the Roman Republic. The section we're beginning today is titled The Mediterranean, a Roman Sea. We're going to see how Rome begins to expand from just a city to control over a much wider area. The slide before you tells some of the story of what takes place during the years that are mentioned when Rome first becomes master of Italy. In 509 BC, prior to what we see here, after over 100 years of rule by the Etruscans, let's see what I have about right here. The Romans overthrew the monarchical system of the Etruscans and established a republic. Rome was destroyed by the Gauls in 390 BC. While the Senate debated whether to build the city at another location, a group of soldiers marched nearby. A centurion gave the order to halt and then added, "We may as well stay here," talking just to the soldiers. Well, the senators took it as a sign, an omen, and so they stayed and rebuilt the city right there. By 338, they had conquered the Latin League. By 270, all of the Greek cities of southern Italy belonged to Rome. Remember before we saw a map where a large part of this area was inhabited by Greeks, and Rome had, by 270, conquered all that area. The Greek colonists who were there didn't like to be ruled by Rome, and so they gave out a cry for help from the Greek king whose name was Pyrrhus. He was a relative of Alexander the Great. Well, he had failed to conquer Macedonia, and was looking for another way to begin an empire comparable to his family member. He wanted to be great also. And so he came over to help the Greeks in this part of Italy. He was successful in his first battle against Rome and sent an envoy to Rome to negotiate a peace settlement. The ex-censor Appius Claudius was still around, by this time a blind old man. Do you remember Appius Claudius? What was he noted for? What did he come up with? You see, when we go over things day by day, when we learn things day by day, you're responsible for knowing those things as we learn them. I talked to Mr. Lamb yesterday about whether you had indeed had in his class the three branches of government. He said, yes, we talked about it a lot. Apparently, the problem is that you think that if you learn something one day and then you have a test on it, then that's to be forgotten. You need to start looking at your learning as a cumulative. You need to learn not just for the next day, that next quiz, that next test. You need to learn for life. You need to learn in such a way that you remember the things that you learn. Go over it so that it becomes a part of your mental capacity, your mental thinking. Appius Claudius was the one who came up with the idea of property tax, which was then used to build what? Roads. And so the road was named after him, the Appian Way, or the Via Appia. Well, he was an old man at this point, and he said this: Pyrrhus must leave Italy, and then we will bargain with him. Well, that led to the maxim, Rome must not negotiate with enemies bearing arms, and never make peace with an enemy on Italian soil. Well, Pyrrhus had to continue to fight, and the second battle was also a victory, but he experienced so many losses that he said, another such victory and I shall be ruined. And so when you're in a situation where your losses are so great that even in victory it's not a benefit to you, that's called a Pyrrhic victory, named after him. You can see on the map his having come over to Italy and the progress he made up in this direction, fighting against Rome. Well, at the time, the people of Syracuse, which is down here in Sicily, asked for help against the Carthaginians. The Carthaginians had come across from Africa and had taken over Sicily, were attacking them, and Pyrrhus gladly consented. He wasn't doing so well against Rome. He thought he would go down here and have some success, and he did in fact come down and defeat the Carthaginians. However, he then claimed lordship over Sicily. Well, that's not exactly what the Sicilians had in mind. And infuriated, they turned on him and drove him out. So once more, he returned to southern Italy, where he was then defeated by the Romans, forcing him to return to Epirus back in Greece. Rome pursued a policy of mercy and fairness over those that they ruled, over the people that they conquered on the Italian peninsula. To many of them, they granted Roman citizenship. To others, a great deal of local independence. Tribute was not demanded, as we've seen over and over again in past civilizations, where the conquerors demanded tribute from those that they conquered. Rome did not do that, but they did demand truce. But that had a way of making the people they conquered a part of Rome, not in necessarily submission of having to pay tribute. Because if they're supplying troops, those troops become part of the Roman army, and so the people become part of the Roman Republic. So Rome pursued a policy which was of great benefit to them. Next, Rome, master of the Western Mediterranean. Next, we're going to look at Carthage. Carthage is right here. Carthage was a colony that was started by the Phoenicians. Remember from over here? The Phoenicians were known for what?
Trade.
Trade, right. They were great sailors. They sailed all over the Mediterranean and out into the Atlantic and possibly even beyond. And so they had this colony here established at Carthage. Carthage became powerful and strong and eclipsed the Phoenicians. When the Phoenicians were pretty much dying out, not much left of them, Carthage was becoming stronger and stronger, and you can see the area over which they eventually ruled. They worshiped the gods of Phoenicia, and so the names of the gods might sound familiar to you. Baal, Haman, and Tanith were two of the corresponding gods of the Phoenicians. Added to their traditional gods were Melkart, which means key of the city, Eshmon, god of wealth and health, and a host of others. They followed some of the same practices that have been practiced by the Canaanites, remember? They sacrificed living children to Baal Haman, as many as 300 in a day, by placing them upon the inclined and outstretched arms of the idol, which would then roll off into the fire beneath. The cries of the children were drowned in the noise of trumpets and cymbals, and their mothers were required to look upon the scene without moan or tear, lest they be accused of impiety and lose the credit due them from the god. So those are the Carthaginians. The Carthaginian Empire included the North African coast, southern Spain, Sardinia, Corsica, and part of Sicily. And you can see where this is going to bring them in conflict with Rome. Now, there are several major differences between Carthage and Rome, and I think that you probably got that in your reading, but let's make sure that we understand. Carthage was superior in what medium, I guess you'd say? In what were the Carthaginians superior? In what kind of fighting? Fighting where?
Oh, on the sea.
On the sea. Thank you. You threw your voice over that way.
Yeah.
No, I was pointing it at Matthew, and you answered. But you had a good answer. They were superior on sea. And can you see that that would be the case? Because who are their ancestors?
Yeah.
The Phoenicians. right? And they were experts on the sea, so the Carthaginians were as well. Now, what about Rome? Where was their superiority, and what kind of fighting? Griff?
On land.
On land, yeah. So you can see there's a real contrast there between the two. The Carthaginians depended on what kind of troops. They didn't have enough of their own, so who did they depend on to help them? Griff?
Mercenary.
Mercenary, right. What does mercenary mean?
Hired guy.
Hired ones, yeah. So they hired troops from peoples that lived around them, maybe even peoples they conquered. So these were not native Carthaginians. We're going to see that that's going to play into something a little bit later. And what about Rome? What kind of troops did they depend on? Griff?
Their allies.
Their allies and just their own people. So we could say native troops. We'll put there, native. That is, they were native to Rome or to the areas they conquered. Just like I said before, they incorporated troops from every place they conquered. So these are people that actually live within the confines of the Roman territory. All right, so as we said, it's bound to happen that there's going to be conflict between the Carthaginians and the Romans, and that comes about. The wars that take place are called Punic Wars. Punic is the word, the Latin word that's used for Carthage. And so we're going to look at the first Punic War against Carthage. Now, there are a couple of major events. Well, first of all, the cause. The cause of the Punic War against Carthage was the island of Sicily. Should go back. This picture shows the Carthaginians used elephants. I didn't mention before, Pyrrhus also used elephants that had become, that's the equivalent of a tank, even bigger than a tank, obviously. Elephants are very large and are very useful in warfare. And Pyrrhus used them to advantage against the Romans, and then the Carthaginians also used elephants. Being in North Africa, they had access to elephants. The cause of the war between Carthage and Rome, this first Punic War, was the island of Sicily. All right, so Rome has a disadvantage when it comes to being on the sea. Their navy couldn't compete with Carthage, and yet they needed to be able to defeat Carthage on the sea. So what was the advantage that Rome had? What was their area of expertise?
On land.
On land. So what is the key? What is the thing that you've got to do is what? What do you think, Zach?
Board the enemy ship.
If you can board the enemy ship, then it's like fighting on land, right? So you're not fighting ship against ship. Now you're on the same place, the same plane with them. Now you can fight as land soldiers. So the problem is what?
Getting on the other.
How do you get onto their ships? First of all, you got to get close enough. That's not too much of a problem. But then what is the problem when you get your ship side by side?
How to get on it.
How to get on it? And what else?
How to keep the ships next to each other.
Exactly. Because you know where we're going, don't you? How to keep the ships next to each other, because what if they drift apart? And then you got soldiers on, bye, sorry, we'll see you around maybe. They're stuck on there. So what do the Romans do? What do they develop in order to help them to alleviate this issue? Zach?
They would they would stab the enemy ship with it was like a harpoon, and then they would board it.
Okay, not exactly a harpoon.
Like a wooden plank.
They had a wooden plank with what?
A spike.
A spike on the end. So they could drop the wooden plank. Now normally that plank could come off if the ship pulled away. But the spike went down into the wood of the Carthaginian ship, attaching them. So now they're not getting away. Now the Romans have the advantage because they've got better fighting soldiers, you see? So they really made the ships into land for them so the soldiers could fight. So the spiked tip plank was a major innovation for them. During the war, of course, the Carthaginians employed elephants, and this is the kind of damage elephants can do. That guy's not having fun. It's not on a trampoline. He was thrown there by the elephant. And of course, the elephants can trample any soldiers that are in their way. The Romans used phalanges, as had the Greeks before, you remember. And this is how many of the armies fought against one another, the Carthaginians as well. They used phalanges, and this is two armies coming together. You remember that you've got the spears pointing out from the front of the phalange, and you got spears pointing out from the next row, and depending on how long their spears were, several rows, and they just keep moving forward. And the guy behind is pushing the guy ahead, so he keeps going. He can't turn around because they move as a unit. Here's a close-up. If you were facing a phalange, what it would look like coming at you. Pretty scary if you're in the front, don't you think? Now, some of the Roman formations used what are called manifolds. We won't get into all of that. We don't need to get that specific. One thing I want to point out about Carthage is concerning their seamanship. There's evidence that quite possibly they even made it to America. And it comes from this coin. They were known for their horses. They used horses a lot. But at the bottom of this coin, there is this. Now that just looks like some squiggly lines to us. But Professor Mark McMenamin, looking at this, feels like he deciphered what it is. They wouldn't have just put a bunch of nonsense at the bottom. He thinks it's a map. He thinks that this part over here is Asia, and that this is Europe, and this is the Mediterranean Sea, and here's the opening of Gibraltar, and then they're showing something out here. And he says that quite possibly is a picture of America. So maybe they made it that far. Either that or it's the island of Atlantis. Take your pick. But I'm voting for America because I'm not sure where Atlantis was, if it existed. And maybe Atlantis was America. Who knows? All right. So this first war takes place in Sicily, as I mentioned. The Romans were able to enact a victory as a result of the development of the plank with the spike on the end. And the last 9 years of the war were relatively quiet until a number of Roman citizens voluntarily presented to the state a fleet of 200 men of war. Those are ships carrying 60,000 troops. So in other words, they weren't getting anywhere. It's kind of back and forth. Nothing much was happening. And some Roman citizens said, look, let's be done with this. And so they donated what was necessary to have this fleet. And they caught the Carthaginian fleet unprepared off the west coast of Sicily, and so overwhelmed it that Carthage sued for peace. So they caught them out in this area and defeated them. Okay, several results of this First Punic War. The first one is that Rome gained Sicily. So this became totally Roman. Secondly, Carthage was forced to pay for Roman losses because Rome was nearly bankrupt. And so they forced Carthage to pay their bills, essentially. They forced them to pay an annual indemnity of 440 talents for 10 years. Thirdly, all Carthaginian restrictions on Roman trade were withdrawn. Carthage had put up some barriers to Rome trading in the Mediterranean. Those were eliminated. And fourthly, the mercenaries that had been helping Carthage weren't paid. Carthage lost. They didn't pay the mercenaries. So 20,000 of these mercenaries attacked the weakened Carthage in what has been called War of the Mercenaries. Their former general, Hamilcar Barca, which his name means he whom Melkart protects, and the word lightning, was called upon to defend the surrounding city. So their former general was called upon to defend the city against the mercenaries that he had commanded. Over 3.5 years later, Hamilcar was able to brutally defeat what had swelled due to overtaxed subject peoples also joining, because in order to pay Rome, Carthage increased the taxes on the people around them, and so they grew from 20,000 mercenaries to 40,000 men in the army, and he was able to brutally defeat them. In the meantime, Rome occupied Sardinia, which Carthage protested. That wasn't part of the deal, but Rome took it. And to avert war, Carthage was required to pay an additional 1,200 talents and surrender both Sardinia and Corsica. The island of Corsica, as just a side note, is the birthplace of a famous man. Anybody know who? In the late 1700s, I believe he was born. Napoleon Bonaparte was born in Corsica. Well, Hamilcar then took his troops to Spain to try to recover some of the power that Carthage had there. And that is going to lead us into the Second Punic War. The setting is this. In 219 BC, Carthage attacked a Roman ally in Spain. Rome responded by sending one army to Spain and another to Carthage. So Rome sends an army here and then down to Carthage. What was the cause? The cause was Carthaginian expansion into Spain. They're going back into Spain again. Okay, what were the major events of the Second Punic War? Well, during the First Punic War, the Carthaginian commander Hamilcar Barca, who we mentioned previously, had brought his 9-year-old son to the altar of Baal Haman, making him swear to someday revenge his country against Rome. The boy's name was Hannibal, and he never forgot his promise. Following the battle death of his father, Hamilcar, and the assassination of his brother-in-law, by this time, the 26-year-old Hannibal, by the way, you'll notice the Baal on the end, his name means grace of Baal. Hannibal was elected the army's leader. And he decided to challenge Rome by crossing the Ebro River, which was considered the border between Carthaginian and Roman territories here in Spain. And then he decided to go on and cross the Pyrenees Mountains, which separate the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, from Gaul, from what we know as present-day France. And then crossing through the Gallic territory, the Gauls were in charge of this area then, crossing the Rhone River, and then crossing the Alps, which is the northern border of Italy, in order to enter the Italian peninsula. He knew that Rome would expect him to come by sea and attack this way. So he thought by going the other direction on land that he would be able to surprise them. They wouldn't be expecting that. He began with 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry, mostly Spaniards and Libyans. But he lost 10,000 of them through desertion and release at the perceived difficulty of the quest. So a lot have said, well, this is impossible. Going through these mountains is one thing, but then going through the Alps, that's something else again. Now, crossing the Alps, he invaded from the north, and he had with him a number of elephants. Now, what kind of climate are elephants used to?
Hot,
Hot climate. What kind of terrain are they used to?
like flat.
Yeah. Can you imagine taking elephants through snowy mountains? That sounds like a disaster before you even start, doesn't it? And it was. He lost, and not only for the elephants, but for the men as well. Taking elephants. Elephants, you know, have big round feet. And that doesn't work so well in mountain areas, does it? What animal does well in mountains?
Goats.
Goats, and they have small cloven hoofs that they can grab onto the mountainside. You've seen them jump around and stuff. Elephants can't do that, right? Well, going through the Alps as he did, Hannibal lost about half of his men, reducing his army to 26,000. And he lost most of his elephants. Now, some reports I've read indicate he lost all but one, and that was his own pet elephant, which was the only Asian elephant among them. Others say that there were more elephants that made it, and I'm not sure which one is accurate. But it's safe to say he lost most of them, if not all. In addition to that, Hannibal got an eye infection, and it caused him to lose sight in one eye. However, he was right. He did surprise Rome in coming through the Alps as he did. Here's the map that shows his direction going through southern France, and then over here, and then down through the Alps to go into Italy. Here's a picture showing Hannibal pointing to Italy from the top of the pass. And he paused there several days to prepare for going down. By the way, I've been to the Alps, and I'm not sure I'd want to walk very far, let alone take a bunch of elephants. Because you can imagine what would happen as they're going along if you are in the front of the whole column of men and animals. What is slowing you down? The snow. I mean, you got to wade through snow, right? How many of you ever walked through snow? Easy? No, especially if it's very deep, right? You ever gone through deep snow that's up to your waist even? Very slow moving. Now, what happens after several thousand men and maybe even elephants have walked through an area? What happens to what was waist-high snow?
It's divided.
It gets divided, so there's a pathway, right? And what is true of that pathway? With so many things walking on it, and remember, it's cold. What happens to your driveway after the car's gone over snow over and over again, and it's really cold?
It gets icy.
Icy. So the first guys going through are wading through snow. Well, if you're very far back, you are now on ice. And in addition to that, the elephants are leaving some nice presents for you along the way. And so you're slipping and sliding not only on ice, but the elephant dung that you've got all these elephants. So not very easy going. This is a coin on a Punic shekel of Hannibal. Okay, that's after he was in Italy. We'll hold off on that for a minute. Let's see. So Hannibal surprised Rome and was waging war against the Romans for the next 15 years. He's in Italy, and he gained many victories. He was successful most of the time. After the initial defeat of the Romans by Hannibal, the Romans said, we need some new leadership, and so they elected 2 new consuls to lead the Roman forces. One of them, Flaminius, pursued Hannibal with the understanding that the other one, Servilius, would join him the next day. So he's going out against Hannibal, and he thinks that he's going to get help the next day. Well, Flaminius came up with a strategy to try to trap Hannibal between himself and this Servilius who's coming out. So he wants to try to make it so Hannibal is in between them once Servilius comes out, so they can attack from both sides. In fact, he was so confident of victory that Flaminius brought along slave traders, carrying fetters and chains because of all the prisoners he thought he would get from this battle. As Flaminius moved his force of 30,000 along a path just north of Lake Trasimene, he could not see what Hannibal was doing because of early morning fog. as the Roman forces caught up with and then engaged the Carthaginians in battle, there was a loud trumpet call. I mean, try to imagine this. It's foggy, and the Romans are going along, and they finally engage with the Carthaginians, and as they're fighting, out of the fog, they hear this loud trumpet sounds. Would that kind of shake you up a little bit? Well, what happened is, following the trumpet sound, out of the mist came the Carthaginian cavalry, which had been waiting on the nearby hills. And so they attacked from out of the fog. And the Roman forces, unable to see what was happening, hampered by the terrain, were unable to maneuver their forces to meet the attack. They were caught by Hannibal's trap. And by the time Servilius arrived with his army, Flaminius and all his men were dead. Well, following the debacle at Lake Trasimene, Fabius Maximus was chosen as dictator for a 6-month rule of absolute rule. You got total control. Just get rid of Hannibal. Well, Fabius decided to harass Hannibal rather than face him in open battle. And he was able to prevent Hannibal from obtaining food supplies. Because the plan was working so well, Hannibal decided that he needed to lure Fabius out of the hills for a full-scale battle. Enough of you messing around, attacking me here and there. Come on out and fight like a man. Come out in the valley here and fight. Well, Hannibal set a nearby village on fire to try to draw Fabius out. But instead of Fabius coming out and fighting, he instead stationed his forces at a mountain pass to prevent Hannibal from rejoining the rest of his army. So Hannibal had gone and set fire to a village. Fabius sent his men into the pass so Hannibal couldn't get back. Now Hannibal is trapped. But he devised a plan to dislodge the enemy, and that was that at night his soldiers rounded up a herd of cattle and tied torches to their tails. What happens if cows, steers, have a torch tied to their tails? It's on fire. What do?
They make noise.
They make noise. Is that all they do?
Yes.
If you had fire attached to your rear end, what would you be doing? Running. And that's what the cattle do. They start running. It's at night. So what happens? The Roman soldiers see all these lights out in the hills, moving. Oh, Hannibal must be on the move. And so they went after them. They left the pass, pursued the cattle. They're out there running after cattle. And this made it possible for Hannibal and his men to escape through the pass and get back to their own army. Well, how did the people of Rome react to Fabius's men chasing after a bunch of cattle in the night? They were the laughingstock of the city. So when his term was ended, he was dismissed, and 2 new consuls were elected to lead the army. And that brings us then to the famous Battle of Cannae in the spring of 216 BC. Rome outnumbered Hannibal 2-1. Rome had 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. Carthage had 19,000 veterans, 16,000 unreliable Gauls that they had picked up along the way, and 10,000 horses. The Roman legions attacked, forcing Hannibal to rely upon superior strategy to avert defeat because he didn't have the manpower. Hannibal arranged his troops to match the Romans by deploying his infantry in the center and his cavalry at the flanks. So here's Hannibal's camp, here are his soldiers, here's the Roman camps, and here are the Roman soldiers. So Hannibal deploys his men to go up right against the Romans. Hannibal then bulged the center of his line forward. So he made the center of his line push forward towards the Romans, which would invite the Romans to attack them. You know, if you're the Romans, where are you going to attack? You're going to attack the ones that are closest to you. So the Romans attacked this bulge. Here's another picture of it. So then what happened? Well, the plan of Hannibal was that he would divide his forces. The Romans attacked, forcing the Carthaginian middle to retreat. So he had his middle bend back, retreat back. That was according to plan. So now the Romans have been drawn into a kind of a pocket. And they found themselves hemmed in on three sides because the infantry of the African infantry is going around this side and around this side. So, and the cavalry has been successful against the Romans, and they're coming in from the back. And you see now the Romans are hemmed in on all sides. Pretty brilliant plan. The surrounded Romans were almost completely wiped out, losing nearly 60,000 compared to Hannibal losing 6,000. And 2/3 of them were Gauls. Even so, Hannibal had this great victory, but he could not defeat the city of Rome itself. He did not have the heavy siege equipment to break down walls. He was unable to recruit the people around Rome because Rome had always treated them all fairly and generously. In their terror of what Hannibal might do, the Senate, however, sanctioned human sacrifice and buried alive 2 Gauls and 2 Greeks to try to get the gods on their side. Well, that leads us to the siege of Syracuse. Oh, here's another drawing of the Battle of Cannae, if you like this one better. See how Hannibal bulged the middle, inviting the Romans to attack. The Romans pushed back. The Carthaginians collapsed. They came around the sides and were able to defeat them. This is the land area where it took place. The next is the siege of Syracuse. Rome's attack on Syracuse was met by a barrage of weaponry engineered by the mathematician Archimedes. Maybe you've heard of him. He delayed Rome's eventual conquest. Next we'll come to the Battle of Zama, which we'll see things will turn on Hannibal. All right, so tomorrow, we don't have an assignment, so just make sure you look over your notes. Make sure you're learning what is there so that when we refer back to it, you will know what we're talking about. All right, any questions? You are dismissed.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.